They said the world stopped when Princess Diana died, when Michael Jackson took his last breath, when Kobe's chopper went down. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared an entire generation for the moment the news broke. Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the soul behind Theo Huxtable, the heartbeat of a television legacy, was gone. Found lifeless in Costa Rica, where he'd quietly slipped away from the public eye, the man who once brought millions of homes together in laughter had exited in silence, and when the call reached Felicia Rashad, the mother who raised him not by blood, but through love, script, and memory, she collapsed before the phone even hit the ground, clawing at the gold chain he'd given her back in 1988, screaming words that weren't lines, weren't scripted, weren't fiction. Not my baby, not my Theo. And in that single moment, every generation who had grown up watching The Cosby Show, who had seen that iconic living room as their second home, who had laughed through Theo's teenage mistakes and cried through his lessons, felt that same wound rip open in their chest. It wasn't just a character dying. It was the death of safety, of nostalgia, of the illusion that the people we loved on screen were somehow eternal. Felicia, who had never stopped calling him her son, was inconsolable. When they played the final voicemail Malcolm had left behind, the very walls of that old sitcom set seemed to mourn with them. "Mom, if I don't wake up one day, just know you were my only light in the dark." The sound crew went silent. Makeup artists wept on the studio floor. Production assistants huddled in corners, their heads in their hands, unable to process the truth. The boy who made us feel okay with being flawed, who made being a teenager less terrifying, was gone. And as clips of Theo and Claire Huxtable flooded TikTok, old reruns trending with captions like, "I didn't know this was goodbye," even strangers who had never watched the show felt the global ache. Because Malcolm wasn't just an actor, he was our brother, our cousin, our first crush, our comfort on lonely nights. And Felicia, she wasn't acting back then when she said, "I love you no matter what." She meant it. And now, sitting in her darkened living room, that same episode playing on loop, she whispered those words to a ghost. The studio sent counselors, friends came by, but no one could pull her out of that grief. She sat on the floor, curled like a mother in mourning, rocking the chain against her chest, repeating like a hymn. "Give me back my child. Please, God, give me back my baby." And as the world watched her unravel in real time, the headlines were flooded with the weight of a generation's heartbreak. "Not our Theo" trended across continents. Candlelight vigils outside her home, murals in Brooklyn, fans posting photos of Malcolm beside their own childhood pictures saying, "He raised me when no one else did." One woman said she named her son after Theo. Another posted that her father walked out at 8 years old, but Theo showed her how to believe in men again. People weren't grieving a celebrity. They were grieving the last piece of a childhood that felt whole. Inside the ICU, Felicia stood over his body, staring at the cross he always wore, his chest still beneath the white sheets, his hand placed gently over a faded script from season 4, the last episode they filmed before he gave her that chain. "You called me your light, Theo," she whispered, "but you were mine." And when the doctors gently asked if she'd like to say her final goodbyes, she shook her head and said, "This isn't goodbye. He's still in every frame, every line, every heartbeat of that show." Keshia Knight Pulliam, who played Rudy, arrived minutes later and crumbled to the floor beside Felicia, sobbing, "He was our protector, our real-life big brother." The room didn't feel like a hospital anymore. It felt like a funeral for innocence, a requiem for an era. Outside, fans carried DVD box sets like holy relics. Someone had written in chalk, "Theo was the reason I smiled." In a world that has learned to grieve collectively through the glow of screens, the internet became the church, the altar, the tomb. Tribute videos, slow piano music under every clip of Malcolm's smile, his laughs, his dances, the way he looked at Felicia like she truly was his mother. It all hit differently now. Every hug between Theo and Claire felt like a prophecy, a goodbye hidden in plain sight. And then came the video no one was ready for. A private recording, never aired, captured just weeks before his death at a small Cosby cast reunion. Malcolm stood, raised a glass and said, "To the woman who taught me what it means to be seen, loved and forgiven. My TV mom, but my real-life guardian angel, I love you." When that video hit the internet, the comment sections drowned in tears. "This wasn't acting," one wrote. "This was real." And just as the public tried to process that truth, more began to... But grief, true grief, doesn't end with the sunset or the scattering of ashes. And when the waves swallowed that white lily from Felicia Rashad's trembling fingers, and the boy who looked like young Theo hugged her at the Costa Rica vigil, it wasn't closure. It was ignition. A final spark that tore through the illusion of resolution and catapulted the entire world into something deeper, something raw, something irreversible. Because what began as a tragedy had now mutated into something far more complicated, a mystery, a reckoning, a haunting that would unravel in the days that followed as Hollywood found itself unprepared for what would surface next. Malcolm-Jamal Warner hadn't just died alone in Costa Rica. He had gone there to disappear, and the notebooks, voice memos, and unsent letters found in his private rented villa days after his death were filled with confessions, journal entries, and blistering truths that shattered the glass house of nostalgia surrounding his legacy, revealing a man who had spent the last 10 years slowly unraveling beneath the weight of perfection, silence, and the impossible expectation to keep smiling, keep performing, keep being Theo when his soul had long outgrown the confines of that scripted life, and when Felicia Rashad was flown back to Los Angeles in a private jet chartered by the network, still refusing to speak, still wearing the chain he gave her like a lifeline. The studio executives were already scrambling behind the scenes because the media storm was only growing fiercer by the hour, and while fans continued to mourn, placing teddy bears on Hollywood Boulevard and flooding social feeds with Theo clips layered under sad acoustic music, inside the highest circles of power, producers and publicists were reviewing those recovered notebooks and growing pale, horrified, not just by the pain Malcolm had buried, but by what he revealed. Years of untreated depression, loneliness amplified by fame, emotional wounds from an industry that typecast him into being a smiling black boy, forever trapped in a house he could never really leave, and a final haunting phrase scrawled across the last page of his journal. "I gave joy to the world, but never kept enough for myself." And that single line, bare, brutal, unforgettable, was what Felicia read aloud when she called an emergency gathering of the remaining Cosby Show cast members 3 days after landing in LA. And not at a studio, not on a stage, but at her own home. Curtains drawn, Malcolm's sweater folded neatly beside a framed photo of them from 1986, and the moment she finished reading those 9 words, silence wrapped around the room like a shroud, until Sabrina LeBeau finally spoke, her voice cracked and unsteady, saying, "We didn't see it. We didn't want to see it." And that broke Keshia again, sobbing into Felicia's lap, whispering, "He saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." And one by one, every cast member began recounting memories that, in hindsight, felt more like cries for help. The days Malcolm wouldn't speak between takes, the times he laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, the unexplained solo trips overseas, the charity events he cancelled last minute claiming he was under the weather. And it became clear, Malcolm had been whispering for years, and no one had heard him. And so Felicia, still hollowed out, her voice barely more than a breath, stood and made the decision that would change everything. She would speak, not as an actress, not as a celebrity, not as Claire Huxtable, but as a mother who lost her son to a silence that she now swore to break forever. And so, on national television, just 6 days after his death, Felicia Rashad went live for a memorial interview on Oprah's special tribute hour titled "When the Smile is a Mask." And she sat there, trembling but composed, dressed in a simple black blouse, no makeup, the chains still resting above her heart. And when Oprah asked her, "What do you want people to know about Malcolm?" she didn't flinch, she didn't falter, she simply said, "He was the strongest man I ever knew, and we failed him." And the world watched as America's TV mom broke again on live television, tears streaming as she described reading his final voice note over and over, hearing him call her light, while knowing she hadn't seen the darkness he was drowning in. And that night, a different kind of grief spread. Not the quiet mourning of a nostalgic loss, but the deafening guilt of a collective blindness, and fans turned their pain into action, launching the Kind Smile Behind the Scenes movement, a campaign that encouraged people to share stories of mental health, hidden sadness, and the pressure to pretend, with thousands sharing their own Theo moments. Times they had smiled while breaking, laughed while hiding, and in a matter of hours, Malcolm's story was no longer just his. It became a mirror, a call, a reckoning. And when Felicia announced the formation of the MJW Foundation, a non-profit, but death, when wrapped in truth and courage, doesn't bury a man, it resurrects him in ways the living can never fully control. And in the weeks following the release of Malcolm's final message to Felicia, the world didn't just mourn harder, it woke up, jarringly, permanently. And as the whispers of grief turned into national dialogue, as classrooms paused to talk about mental health, as networks re-evaluated how they treated child actors and creators of color, something else was stirring, quietly, underground, waiting, as though even Malcolm's ghost wasn't finished yet, and that something arrived in the form of a dusty, locked safe discovered in the back closet of his Los Angeles townhouse, where a property manager doing routine inventory stumbled upon a fireproof box labeled "Truth Isn't Always Pretty." And Disney issued public apologies for decades of exploitation, and for the first time in history, a coalition of former child stars, many of whom hadn't spoken publicly in years, gathered for a televised town hall hosted by Oprah called The Stage We Survived, and it was there that Keke Palmer said through tears, "Malcolm gave us permission to be more than smiles. He gave us back our stories." And when the series The Lie That Laughed premiered 6 months later at the Sundance Film Festival, every major critic, liberal and conservative, legacy and independent, agreed on one thing. It was the most important artistic statement of the decade, a stunning indictment of performative black joy, capitalism's hunger for innocence, and America's toxic nostalgia. And the final scene, nearly shot for shot from Malcolm's own script, left audiences sobbing in silence as the fictional boy Zion turns toward the camera, rain falling, and says, "You asked me to stay small so you could remember laughing. I grew, and I hurt, and I'm still here." Barely. And that line alone trended worldwide for 72 hours under Dara Zion Was Malcolm. And in classrooms from Atlanta to Lagos, teachers began using his work to discuss identity, grief, and mental wellness in black communities, while pastors began quoting his journal in sermons, and murals went up in New York, South Africa, Brazil, and Compton, each with the same 4 words, "Still here, barely healing." And yet still, the world wasn't finished peeling back the layers of this man we all thought we knew, because just when the series premiered, Felicia received another call.